The wind in the mountains carries differently when you've lived with it long enough. It doesn't just howl or whisper, it speaks. You learn to hear when something's off. When the trees lean too far towards silence. When even the ravens won't land. Jonah Avery had learned that language the hard way. He wasn't the type to run from the world. Not exactly. But after decades as a park ranger, and too many years watching people search for things they'd never find their children, their answers, sometimes themselves, Jonah had chosen a quieter kind of life. A cabin tucked against the tree line. A radio that mostly gathered dust. And Maeve, the only voice that had ever felt louder than the wind. Now, most days were simple. Feed the stove. Check the traps. Track. Listen. But that day, the forest wasn't speaking. It was watching. Jonah had stepped off the main trail, not out of carelessness but instinct. A fin trail. A broken branch that didn't look like windfall. Something pulling at the edge of his attention like a memory he couldn't place. He followed it. Slow and deliberate. One boot pressing into the moss without a sound. That's when he saw them. The footprints. Small. Lighter than his own. But deep enough to be recent. A child's. Maybe barefoot, or in worn-down shoes. The stride was uneven. Like whoever had left them wasn't walking with purpose. Just drifting. Jonah's heart didn't race. But it shifted. Like something old. Inside him. Had stood up after a long sleep. He crouched low. Brushing his fingers over the imprint. The moss hadn't yet puffed back up. Whoever left these was close. He looked up, scanning the trees. Then he saw the light again, not fire. Not a flashlight. Just a faint, steady glow bleeding through the underbrush about 20 yards ahead. It was warm. Almost golden. It didn't belong. And neither, he realized, did she? She was kneeling in a pocket of clearing, barely taller than the flowers she crouched beside. Maybe 8, maybe 9. A blue sweater too thin for the cold. Her hands moved gently, as if afraid to break the quiet around her, placing one tiny object after another into a glass jar. Pebbles. Bright with mica. A beetle that glittered when it turned. Pieces of light. Trapped. She didn't see him. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Jonah stayed low. Unmoving. Watching the slow, careful ritual of a child who had made a world out of the broken things the forest had to offer. And for a second, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Protectiveness. But then the shadows shifted behind her. From beneath the slope, where a hill should have been nothing but roots and rock, something opened. A door. Or not a door. Exactly. A cut into the earth. Obscured by moss and brush. Too perfect to be accidental. A man emerged. He unfolded from the bunker slowly. Not like someone surprised, but someone who expected to be watched. He stood tall. Lean. Face unreadable. Scanning the tree line as if counting the birds that hadn't sung. His clothes were clean. Too clean. His movements practiced. And his eyes. They didn't search. They calculated. Rhea. He called out. Voice low, and even Come inside. The girl didn't react, just kept adding to the jar her strange little museum of the overlooked. He called again, a touch of edge this time. Rhea. Now. No yelling. No threat. Just the weight of a man used to being obeyed. Jonah's breath slowed. There was something wrong about the way she didn't flinch, about the way she looked back not with fear, but resignation. Like this had happened before. Like this place. This strange hollow in the earth. This silence was home. She stood, hesitating only to tighten the lid of her jar. And when she turned, Jonah saw it clearly for the first time, the bunker mouth, framed in rotting wood and draped in moss like an open grave. A thin metal pipe rose nearby, releasing a slow breath of steam. It coiled into the air and vanished. That was no temporary shelter. It was built to keep something, or someone. And in that moment, Jonah knew this wasn't an accident. Not someone squatting. Not someone hiding from the storm. It was intentional. Buried. And the girl, she didn't vanish into the bunker. She returned to it. Jonah stayed hidden. The man glanced once more across the trees, his eyes brushing over Jonah's hiding place, like fingers feeling for a pulse. Then he stepped inside, sealing the darkness behind him. But that wasn't the end. Because even after they disappeared, Jonah could still see it. The jar, still clutched in the girl's hand as she went underground. A child's fragile collection of brightness, carried into the dark. And just beneath the earth, something waited. Something he hadn't yet seen. But it had seen him. And the forest was no longer silent. The girl didn't speak. Not once. Just stood there with her jar in both hands, still and small beneath the canopy of trees, her figure half swallowed by the shadows at the bunker's mouth. Jonah held his breath behind the thicket, his body motionless, but his heart alert, every instinct, every quiet wilderness-honed warning bell tolling in his chest. Then the man leaned down beside her, his lips close to her ear, murmuring something Jonah couldn't hear. Whatever he said, it made her shoulders drop. Her gaze, which had once lingered on her beetle and stone collection with a kind of innocent wonder, now dulled. She clutched the jar tighter. And then the man's eyes lifted, not aimlessly scanning the trees, but locking onto Jonah's hiding place with precise intent. Their gazes met, not for a fleeting second, but long enough to communicate something colder. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't call out. He simply straightened and said it clearly, plainly, with a kind of weight that turned Jonah's stomach. Inside. Rhea. The name landed like a dropped match in dry grass. The girl obeyed without a word. No pleading. No glance back. Just turned toward the open hatch in the earth and disappeared into the dark. Jonah stayed frozen, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his hands empty, palms damp. He hadn't moved an inch. And yet, he felt as if something inside him had shifted permanently. Because that name Rhea, it didn't echo like a stranger's. It rang with the hollow familiarity of something half-remembered, something that didn't belong in a place like this. Not in this wilderness. Not with a man like that. Moments later, the man emerged again, alone this time, and walked straight toward Jonah's cover. Not with urgency, but the careful gait of someone who knew exactly what he'd find. "I can see you," he said softly. "Might as well come out." There was no threat in the voice, but no welcome either. Jonah stepped forward slowly. Hands up. The trees creaked above them. The air had grown thick with a coming storm. Got turned around. Jonah muttered. Didn't mean to intrude. The man watched him, noted the rifle, the boots, the compass around Jonah's neck. His eyes didn't miss a thing. "This is private land," he said. "There are markers." "Didn't see any," Jonah replied. "They're subtle. Like me." There was a long pause between them. The kind of pause you don't fill unless you're sure it's safe to speak. Then, with an unexpected flick of his wrist, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded map. "Here," he said, "if you want to find your way back." His hand didn't tremble, but his jaw did, just slightly. And that's when Jonah realized this man wasn't afraid of being caught. He was afraid of being found. Not today. Not now. But eventually. His movements carried a readiness like someone already packed, already halfway to vanishing. Someone who lived as if every knock on the door might be the last. Jonah took the map, said little more, and turned away. Not because he was done with this, but because he wasn't. The forest closed behind him like a curtain. And when he stepped back into the quiet warmth of the cabin, Maeve was waiting by the window. Tea long grown cold beside her. She looked up, eyes scanning his face the way she used to, after long shifts searching for the invisible things no one else saw. "Didn't expect you back this early." Jonah didn't answer at first. He unhooked his pack, set the rifle against the wall, and only then spoke. His voice low. "I saw a girl, out near the eastern ridge. Looked maybe 9. Blue sweater, bare hands." "Was she lost?" Maeve asked. "No," Jonah said. "That's the problem." He told her everything. The clearing, the jar, the man, the bunker hidden in the roots, and the name, Rhea. That's when Maeve paled. Her hands dropped to her lap, still and cold. "Rhea," she whispered. "God." She stood slowly, crossed the room to a stack of newspapers by the fireplace. One slid free from beneath a crossword book. She opened it with hands that trembled more than the man's had. A headline, a face, a name in bold print. Rhea Winston, age 8, missing for 19 days. Jonah stared down at the photo, the same quiet eyes, the same dark hair. The smile was different. It was a before smile, from some other life. "Jonah," Maeve said softly, "where exactly did you see her?" But he didn't answer right away. Because the photo in front of him, bright and smiling and neatly dressed, didn't match the image burned into his mind. A girl who collected beetles, who followed orders, who vanished beneath the ground without a sound. She hadn't just gone missing. She'd been taken somewhere, forgotten. And somehow, by accident or fate, or something stranger, Jonah had found her. Or maybe the forest had shown her to him. And what came next would change everything. The article gave her name: Rhea Winston, 8 years old. Disappeared from a quiet neighborhood 2 towns over. Last seen getting into a dark sedan with her father. Her father, Raymond Winston, former military, divorced, lost custody a year ago after a string of behavioral issues and a psychiatric hold no one liked to talk about. The courts had made a decision. The grandmother got guardianship. Raymond disappeared soon after. And now, so had Rhea. The photo was grainy, printed in low resolution, above a plea from law enforcement. If seen, do not approach. Call immediately. Jonah didn't hesitate. He dialed the local trooper post with slow fingers, explaining everything in the same calm tone he'd used to report lost hikers for 30 years. He gave them the coordinates, described the girl, the bunker, the man. Said nothing about the look in the man's eyes, the one that had held no fear. Only calculation. He hung up. Saturday, with Maeve in the half-light of their cabin. The soft tick of the stove filling the spaces where breath couldn't. "You did the right thing," she said, hand resting over his. But Jonah only stared at the map. The papers still smelled faintly of pine. The edges were worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. A single route drawn in pencil. No labels. No names. A way out. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of guilt, but because the forest still pressed against the windows, not in wind or noise, but in watching. And then, footsteps. Not imagined. Not distant. Real. Wet gravel shifting on a boots. A shadow moving past the porch light. Careful not to step too close. Jonah's hand went instinctively to the latch. He opened the door before the knock came. The man from the woods stood there, soaked, still, and somehow smaller in the rain. Raymond Winston. His jacket hung heavy on his frame. Hair plastered to his forehead. No girl. No car. Just him, and whatever had brought him here. "I came for the map," he said. "You mentioned the cabin. I figured this was the one." His voice was level, measured, but something behind his eyes flickered. Jonah stepped aside slowly. "Come in. Get dry." Maeve was already rising from her chair, her eyes wide. But Jonah gave her a look soft but urgent that said, "Stay quiet. Stay behind me." The man stepped inside. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, warmer, more vulnerable. He stood just inside the door, dripping rain onto the worn pine floor. His eyes flicked toward the table, where the newspaper still lay open. Rhea's smile, still frozen in time, the headline bold beneath it. His face didn't change. He turned to Jonah. "I'm not here for the map." And then from his jacket pocket came the glint of metal. The gun wasn't raised. Not yet. But it was real. Heavy. Intentional. "I need you to listen," he whispered. Maeve took a step backward, into the shadows of the hallway. Jonah didn't move. "Whatever you think this is," he said, calm but low, "you're wrong." Raymond shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not." His voice cracked then, just barely, like a frozen branch, giving under its own weight. "She's mine. They were going to take her. They did take her. He just took her back." He spoke with a kind of haunted clarity, not wild, not manic, just a man convinced the world had betrayed him. "You told the police," he said. Not a question. Jonah didn't lie. "Yes." A long silence followed, the kind that vibrates in your ribs, not your ears. "Then I can't stay," Raymond said. And this time, he did raise the gun. Not in fury, not to kill. Just enough to say, "Don't follow me." "She's safe," he added, almost like a promise. "She sleeps through storms, like her mother used to." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Where is she?" "Far enough," Raymond replied. "And if you try to find her again, I won't be so calm." Then he turned toward the door. But just before he reached it, a crack of thunder shook the glass in the windows. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain. Sirens. Far off, but growing. Raymond froze. Then almost imperceptibly he smiled. "Guess I waited too long." And without another word, he vanished back into the night. Jonah ran after him. But the dark swallowed everything, the man. The sound. The footprints in the mud. Gone. Just the trees again. Just the jar on the table. Just the name on the newspaper and the echo of something too late to stop. And still not over. Raymond didn't try to run at first. He just stood there, soaked in rain. One hand still gripping the pistol. The other twitching like it wanted to undo something it couldn't. Jonah held his ground. Barely 10 feet away. Heart steady in that way. It only gets after a lifetime in wild places. Behind him, he could hear Maeve Rose. In some stories. But to Jonah, always Maeve in the hallway, whispering into the old landline. Words like urgent, armed, child. Then the sirens started. Distant, wailing, closer than they should have been. Raymond's eyes changed. They sharpened, not afraid but cornered, like an animal that knew the trap had sprung. "They'll take her," he said, barely louder than the storm. "Put her back into that system, into that house. She was never safe there." "You brought her into a bunker," Jonah replied. "I brought her home." And then, as casually as exhaling, Raymond fired. The bullet tore through the room, striking the wall inches from Jonah's head. Wood splintered. Maeve screamed. But Jonah was already moving. He dropped low, rolling toward the mounted rifle near the fireplace. Old, oiled, ready, the same one he hadn't fired in years, but never forgot how to hold. By the time he turned back, Raymond was gone. The front door hung open. Rain slashed through it sideways. Jonah didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the dark, rifle in hand, following the direction of snapped branches and fresh tracks across the soaked ground. His knees ached. His lungs burned. But his instincts, they were still sharp. Still his. The forest swallowed sound, but not motion. He saw it then, a flash of movement between trees, a figure slipping through the dark like a shadow with purpose. Jonah raised the rifle, called out once. "Raymond, stop." But there was no answer. So Jonah followed. The forest he knew so well became something else. Alive. Breathless. The kind of quiet that meant something was waiting. A gunshot cracked through the dark. Too close. Jonah ducked. Rolled. Came up behind a tree trunk, slick with rain. The second shot missed. Two tore bark into splinters beside his ear. Raymond had training, but Jonah had the land. He moved wide, circled low, listened. And when the third shot didn't come, he crept forward. Raymond was crouched behind a fallen log, struggling to reload with shaking hands. Jonah stepped out from the shadows. "You don't have to do this." Raymond turned just as Jonah fired. Not to kill. Just one. Deliberate shot. The bullet struck Raymond's thigh, spun him to the ground with a scream of pain. The gun flying from his hand. Jonah reached him first. Kicked the weapon aside. Stood over him in the rain. Breath slow and heavy. Raymond looked up at him. Eyes wide, not with fear, but grief. "You don't understand," he rasped. "She's all I have." Moments later, blue lights flared through the trees. Flashlights cut through the dark like knives. Officers shouted. One restrained Raymond. Another examined the wound. A third pulled Jonah aside. "Where's the girl?" they asked. Jonah's face darkened. He left her behind. They found her an hour later. Deep in the forest. Back at the bunker, the one the rain had nearly erased from view. The hatch had been left cracked open. Not carelessly. Not in panic. Like someone had planned not to return. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Packaged food. A cot. A lantern that had burned out sometime after midnight. And a small shape, curled beneath a pile of thermal blankets. She didn't look up when the light fell on her. Didn't move when the officers stepped in. But when one of them knelt beside her and said her name gently, her eyes fluttered open wide and dark, shining with something that wasn't fear, exactly, but disbelief. And beside her, a glass jar, lid sealed tight. Inside, small treasures gathered from the forest beetles. Leaves, tiny stones, bits of colored thread. One had the faint shimmer of mica in it. Another still twitched. She clutched the jar with both hands, as if it held her name. "Rhea," the officer said again. She didn't nod, didn't speak. But after a long silence, she whispered, voice thin and scratchy, like wind through broken glass. "Blue is for hiding." It wasn't clear who taught her that. But the sweater she wore, same one from the photograph, had faded nearly to gray in the light. They lifted her gently. She didn't fight, but she didn't let go of the jar. Outside, The storm had finally broken. But for Rhea, the quiet was just beginning. The station was too bright. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting the walls in a pale, artificial blue. Rain still streaked the windows, though the storm had passed, leaving only a restless quiet in its wake, the kind that settles after something breaks. Rhea sat at a small table in the corner of the break room, knees drawn to her chest, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of hot cocoa someone had warmed for her. She hadn't touched it, but she held it the way she had held the jar close to her chest, as if the warmth alone might tell her what to do next. Maeve sat across from her, not speaking, just present, a soft scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Her fingers fiddled quietly with the edge of a napkin. She didn't ask questions, didn't lean in, just waited like a woman who knew what silence could mean, and how long it sometimes took to come back from it. Jonah stood by the window, watching the wet dark beyond the glass. His sleeve was still torn from the graze, but it had stopped bleeding hours ago. His face held no pride, no triumph, only a deep, slow kind of ache, the kind that comes from seeing something too late and wondering if you still got there in time. Behind him, an officer spoke quietly with a woman from Child Services. A report was being filed. A grandmother was still in hospital care. The system was already in motion, slow, procedural, impersonal. Jonah glanced at Maeve. She looked up at him without speaking, then turned back to the girl. "Do you want more cocoa?" "Rhea," she asked softly. Rhea didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to the window, to the trees beyond it, and Jonah saw something change, barely. Not trust, not comfort, but recognition. The same way the forest sometimes seems to notice you back. Maeve waited another moment, then turned to Jonah and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "What if we took her in, just until her grandmother recovers?" Her voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of someone offering something that wasn't a solution, but a beginning. Jonah turned that thought over in his mind. Slowly, like a stone that had been buried under snow, still cold from the thaw. He thought about the jar, the silence, the name whispered underground. He thought about the way the girl had stepped into the bunker without protest, and how long it might take for that stillness to leave her. But most of all, he thought about the way the forest had led him to her, not through signs or markers, but through something older, something that didn't speak in words, but in instinct. And maybe that was enough. He nodded. Once. Slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, maybe we could." The woman from Child Services stepped over, her shoes soft on the tile. "We'll need to file paperwork," she said. "Clearance. A few days to process." Maeve stood and offered the faintest smile. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." Rhea still hadn't spoken, but as Maeve helped adjust the blanket draped over her shoulders, she leaned just slightly toward the older woman's warmth. And outside the station window, the trees stood waiting, quiet, watching, as if they, too, knew the truth. Not every rescue is loud. Not every ending is a door slamming shut. Some are just the first step toward something else. something that grows slowly, but grows. Nonetheless, the forest keeps its secrets, but sometimes it offers one back. A name, Ahar, a quiet child with eyes like still water carrying everything she couldn't say in the palm of her hands. Not every story ends when the danger passes. Some linger in the silence afterward, in the space between what was taken and what might still be saved. And maybe, just maybe, what we stumble into by accident was never an accident at all. If this story left something with you, a feeling, a memory, a question you can't quite put down, tell us below. We're listening. Like the video if it stayed with you. Subscribe for the next piece of the truth when it surfaces. And until then, keep your eyes on the trees. They remember more than we think.